So a very surprising announcement of Games Workshop's new Allies rules means that now Imperium armies can ally the leagues of Votann Space Dwarves into their forces. Let's talk about some of the implications of this and what might be strong if you choose to do so. Hello and welcome back to Warspets Tactics, where today we're taking a more focused look at one of the key takeaways from Games Workshop's big new army rule reveal. Around about 12 hours ago or so, Games Workshop and Warhammer community revealed that there'd be a big new detachment change for Warhammer 40k, and when they were talking about the Allied Battle Brothers section of it, it does seem that literally any Imperial army is now going to be able to take a small patrol of Leagues of Votann along if they want to, and what's more, it won't even cost you any command points. Let's talk about some of the implications of that from the lore, then talk about the mechanics of how you can ally them to the army, some of the strongest Votann units that you might want to include in a patrol if you want to, and a few closing thoughts. So as mentioned, here is the rule for the Battle Brothers rule. This one comes from the Arcs of Omen tournament pack, and basically states that along with a few more likely options, Imperium can ally some Leagues of Votann for free in one patrol detachment that doesn't cost you any more CP. Games Workshop didn't actually reveal the entire rule section for this, so my guess would be that there's very likely to be a similar rule in place for the Tau Empire as well. I feel like if anything they'd be even more likely than the Imperium to get such a rule, seeing as there is some good lore with the Leagues of Votann allying and trading with them in the past in the form of the Demiurge, and they were even the race that taught the Tau Empire how to use ion weapons, a major part of their arsenal. Overall, I must admit this change did take me by surprise. In 8th and 9th edition, Games Workshop have generally been very restrictive of any armies taking choices outside the main big alliances, Imperium, Eldar, Chaos and the rest, though I guess with the Leagues of Votann being what they are in the lore, there's definitely more potential to blur the lines. As I'm sure most of you who are keeping up with the 40k news are well aware, technically the kin of the Leagues of Votann are cloned abhumans, but broadly speaking they seem to have been classified under Xenos by Games Workshop. Say for example in the Warhammer 40k web store they appear under the Xenos section and haven't created their own category or anything like that. I guess the Imperium would kind of deem them to have significantly diverged from their ancestors in the days long past, basically initially becoming the squat Space Dwarves, and then at some stage having their society kind of half taken over by AIs, technology that the Imperium really isn't too fond of. With the broad strokes of the lore in the Codex, the Votann tend to inhabit the galactic core in their great leagues, generally not overtly hostile to the Imperium and far more so against the more aggressive Xenos threats, but they're certainly not part of the Imperium and very much their own empire, which isn't something that the Imperium generally likes. From their background, it certainly seems plausible that they might join forces when they need to against a greater foe, though I'm not necessarily convinced that they'd do so much more than, say, races like Tau, Eldar, or maybe Kroot, all of which are perhaps a bit more broadly on the side of order. And while they certainly don't get along with the Imperium, there's plenty of history of them teaming up to fight something that's a much greater threat, whether it's the oncoming swarms of the Tyranids, or the perhaps more downright evil machinations of Chaos. I guess one thing that will be on the side of small allied Votann forces is that they tend to be very mercantile and will often support Imperial forces provided they're paid with resources that they deem appropriate. Apparently there's some lore in the Codex of them being hired out by some Blood Angels when they needed them to lend a hand. I feel like some Imperial forces might well get on with them better than others though. Some are definitely a bit more pragmatic, whereas others are a lot more Puritan. It might well feel a bit more weird to have, say, the secretive Dark Angels allying out some Space Dwarves, rather than, say, some Imperial Guardsmen on a frontier world recruiting some mercenaries to help them out against a threat that they can't manage. Obviously, there's definitely a cynical response to this as well, which is that Games Workshop probably wants as many people as possible to buy their new Space Dwarves, and what better way to encourage people to at least try them out than allow small detachments of them in a whole load of Imperial armies, which generally comprise of around about 50% of Warhammer 40k players in general. Particularly if you add Tau to that, then there's quite a lot of incentive for people to try them out, and I'm sure some people at least might be tempted to expand that onwards into a bit more of a complete army, so I feel like there might be a little bit of a sales reason behind this as well. I would be just a little bit skeptical about this kind of rule standing the test of time though. We've certainly had times in the past where you could more freely ally things like Imperium and Xenos forces, and then suddenly when a new edition came out, all of a sudden you couldn't again. I feel like this is the sort of rule that really isn't guaranteed to stand the test of time, and they might well flip it back at the flip of a switch. In any case though, let's take a look at the actual rules that we know so far, and how it might make sense to ally some Leagues of Votann to your forces if you wanted to. As they mentioned in that Battle Brothers rule, basically you get to take one patrol detachment of Leagues of Votann, but rather than costing the usual 2 CP that it has before, it will be completely CP free. I guess the main price that you're paying, will be the troops tax, plus the fact that the Leagues of Votann lose a bunch of their special rules by allying. The patrol detachment is definitely good enough for Leagues of Votann Allied Army. It encompasses all of their force organisation slots, so you can run at least 2 of basically any of their units. I'd say the biggest question for this at the moment is whether or not they will get any sort of exemption that prevents them breaking your pure faction bonuses. Say, for example, Space Marines get their combat doctrines for extra AP if you don't take any allies along, but a bunch of the things that are counted as more common allies or leaders typically have rules that get around that sort of restriction. Say, for example, you can add an Inquisitor to your force without breaking the army-wide rules, and the same with, say, an Imperial Knight Freeblade. As per the previewed rules, there currently isn't anything to say that they definitely get that, but the fact that they're mentioned in basically the same paragraph as the Inquisition and the Freeblades is definitely a good sign. Whether or not they get that, though, is going to be a really big deal. If they're, say, making Space Marines lose their combat doctrines and Sisters losing their miracle dice, I feel like it's often just really not going to be worth the trade-off. So basically, whether or not they gain the Agents of the Imperium rule to allow their allies is going to be a very big deal or not when you hire them out. Otherwise, though, the other major drawback for taking Leagues of Votann as allies is that they won't be getting their judgment tokens, arguably the single strongest thing about the entire faction. As I'm sure anyone loosely familiar with them would know, Leagues of Votann like to stack judgment tokens on units that annoy them in one way or another. If you have one, you auto wound them on a 6+ to hit, going up to having 3 on a target, and then every attack that you make auto wounds on a 4+ to hit, absolutely crazily strong even with the lightest weapons in your arsenal. The way that this is limited mechanically is that the main judgment token rule section says that you can't gain them by the normal rules there, and then basically every other way of gaining a judgment token on an enemy unit says that you can only access it if every unit in your army is in the same league. If the units aren't Votann, then they aren't in the same league, so it would basically break judgment tokens outright. I would say that this looks like it's fairly bad news for Leagues of Votann allied units for being particularly efficient. I feel like particularly since Games Workshop bumped up the points cost and everything in the army, the points are kind of reflective of their ability with the judgment tokens available, and if they don't have them available, then they're probably going to be a little bit on the underpowered side. A lot of their gun profiles are pretty amazing when they have the tokens, but maybe just a bit so-so if not, to the point where you might as well just take things from your primary army. The Votann stratagems are also amazing as well, but rather annoyingly, if you want to ally them, a whole bunch of them tend to key off judgment tokens, so you wouldn't be able to do the one that's got 4 rerolls to hit, or the one that allows you to return fire with a Hearthkin Warrior squad, as both of those need a judgment token on your foe. Beyond that, they also would lose their Warlord traits and relics. You can only buy them in if you've got a Votann Warlord to begin with, but you would get to keep the option to upgrade models to the Votannic Council. So I guess you could have a High Carl, Lord Grimnir, or a Brockir Forge Master, though again you wouldn't be able to buy their unique Warlord traits, some of which are quite good. In any case, though, I guess the challenge would then be to try and get the most value out of the Votann Codex for things that don't need judgment tokens or those stratagems or warlord traits, and there are a fair amount of good things. For the HQ section, I feel like perhaps out of any of them for an allied army, then the Grimnir could be a really interesting choice. That guy's the Votann Psyker, he could allow you to do psychic actions and things, and he's got a spell to just sit there and farm up command points each turn, as well as making one unit in your army harder to kill and making them a bit tougher. Perhaps particularly powerfully, for some reason they made that Skeen wrought power to farm the command points completely independent of any other caps on farming CP, so you could add that to something in your own army that generates additional CP and be absolutely swimming in them. Definitely an HQ that could add big value to a faction that's a bit CP starved. Otherwise, out of the rest of them, I feel like the Iron-Haired Champion is another interesting one. Still also a very solid combat threat, though again he would perhaps be missing his Relic Exacta hammer, which makes him into a bit more of a generalist one, rather than one that's good against heavy targets. The Iron Master's okay, and could be good for helping out land fortresses and things. It is sad to miss out on that Forge Master Warlord trait though, which negates incoming damage. And I feel that the Karl and Uthar might be okay for certain combos, such as giving out 4 rerolls to hit for a unit, maybe the Iron here. But I feel like they're probably going to be on the back burner as choices, seeing as one of their primary purposes is judgment tokens, which you don't get as allies. For the troops, in a patrol detachment you would need to take a troops choice, and that will be the Hearthkin Warriors currently. This is probably the biggest tax of taking the patrol detachment, as they're going to be a unit that's not necessarily particularly powerful when they don't have the tokens. I feel like either you just want to have them cheap and have them babysit a home field objective or something, or you could upgrade them to the med pack for a bit more survivability, and the Magna Rail rifle does pack a pretty powerful anti-tank shot if you did want to give them a little bit more bite. Otherwise, there's plenty of other good stuff. The Hernkin bikes are pre-game movers with a good movement and objective secured, pretty handy for just about any army, particularly with that accelerated stratagem to zoom 24 inches in a turn. They're a very nice unit, even if they're not going to deal as much damage without the tokens. The Einhir Hearthguard are perhaps a Votann unit that still spam out mortal wounds very well. They're not quite as dependent on judgment tokens for their damage output, but I guess that they might mean that you want a High Karl or Uthra around for the full rerolls on their Vulcanite blasters. Again, choices that aren't particularly great if you don't have the judgment tokens in play. The Chthonian Berserks, perhaps in Sagittars, again I think are a unit that's just efficient enough to justify itself without the tokens. I feel like the Plasma Axes are probably better if you do have tokens around with their low strength. I'd want to take their Concussion Maws. You could potentially even just take a small patrol detachment in Cronus Hegemony maybe, and have them be ridiculously threatening even with no other buffs. Finally, of course, and another very interesting one, is that you can take the Mighty Hecaton Land Fortress. If you've got an army that's lacking in some durable long-range firepower, it does seem like it could be pretty tempting. Maybe an okay choice for an army like perhaps Custodes or Grey Knights, where otherwise you might be thinking about things like Armiger Helverins or something. In theory, you could still do that crazy railgun combo with Uthar the Destined, and have it blast off basically an automatic splash damage shot every turn. Though a lot of people seem to like using that heavy SP conversion beamer as well. That one can put out some pretty serious firepower if you can skewer a couple of units at longer range. It is kind of interesting that with the points cost of the Leagues of Votann units, if you took a fairly hefty patrol, you could run an army that's more Leagues of Votann than it is your primary force. Though I do feel that by the point that you're getting that, you might be seriously missing the judgment tokens to the extent where there's probably not much point in taking the primary force, and you might as well run pure Leagues of Votann again for the judgment. Definitely an interesting enough option though, to have a Leagues of Votann army that trades out a bunch of their damage dealing mechanics for access to any single one of the Imperial factions. With such a limited roster that the Leagues of Votann have, I'm sure there's got to be at least some tempting or powerful combos there. Overall, of course, we will have to see the full rules for this, but my first guess is that it'll be a usable combo that you can take in 40k, but probably not widely used among Imperial armies, even if they do get the exemption to breaking your army-wide special rules. If they do break your army-wide special rules, I think they're going to be super niche, or just only taken for fun purposes. If they don't, then they might gain you access to some command points, plus some units to fill battlefield roles like hefty Chthonian Berserk melee, a big land fortress, or Grimnir farming those points. I have a feeling with their points cost currently though, that as the allied force would lack judgment tokens, it's unlikely to be too oppressive, so hopefully should mean it's a fun allied option that doesn't detract too much from the game. To be honest, I do think that both from Games Workshop's point of view and people in general, I think that it's probably in their interest not to make this the new best thing. I think they made really quite a good move in 7th edition where they turned away from more de-restricted allies, as it just gave you some very silly sites on the top of tournament tables and things. It just really doesn't make too much sense for Games Workshop to make a game where the rules incentivize really weird combos of different allies that might not work together very often in the lore. I remember the silliness of 7th edition where you had things like Riptide Wing allied with a bunch of Space Marine Centurions or Eldar Wraith Knights. It made for armies that looked like a strange mishmash of heavy units, and I think it was a change that a lot of people enjoyed when they moved on to 8th edition and just said yes, mainly just field armies out of your codex. A few of the sensible ones can ally, like other Imperium or other Eldar armies. I think it would just be a bit depressing if the best Imperial lists turned out to be ones that had Leagues of Votann in them, and people had to choose between either having the strongest rules in the game and potentially compromising their army's look and feel if they didn't really want to run Votann. On the other hand, for all that though, I do hope that they let them ally with Tau, however. I feel like it perhaps makes even more sense for Tau to get them as basically another different flavour of alien auxiliary, and they do have some proper lore reasons to be working together in the past, such as their demiurge fluff, and unlike Imperial armies when they usually have a very decent amount of allies and support to choose from, Tau armies have generally not had allies for a really long time, and this feels like quite a good and lore appropriate way to get them one. So anyway, let me know what you make of Imperium allying with the Leagues of Votann. Do you think it's a good change or a bad one? And for the people who are tempted to have some mercenary Space Dwarves allied with their Space Marines or Guardsmen, what would you be most tempted to pick up? If you've enjoyed the video, then feel free to subscribe to Auspex Tactics, but I'll certainly keep the regular 40k stuff coming. If you'd like to check out my full review of the changes that Games Workshop previewed, I'll leave a link to the big video down in the video description. Otherwise, if you have been enjoying the videos on the channel quite a bit, I would just like to mention as well that Auspex Tactics does have a Patreon page, and that's how I can afford to keep on making videos like this quite so often. If you are enjoying a bit, any support is enormously appreciated, keeping them coming. Channel patrons do get a fair few advantages, seeing certain videos early, regular votes to see what sort of things come next on the channel, and automatic entry into the regular prize giveaways with a chance to win some big model kits each month. If any of that sounds good to you, or you'd just like to help support, the link is down in the video description. In any case, a massive thank you for listening, and I'll hope to see you guys next time.